The morning sun cast long shadows across Bugram Airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the supply depot, her boots crunching against the gravel. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other, checking inventory numbers for the third time that week. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what her paperwork said she was, a logistics officer managing supply chains in Afghanistan. The men and women working around her saw nothing unusual, just another day of counting crates and coordinating shipments. Sarah had always been good at blending in. At 5'6" with brown hair usually tied back in a regulation bun, she didn't stand out in a crowd. She spoke softly, smiled politely, and seemed to prefer paperwork to combat. The other officers in her unit often forgot she was even there during briefings. When they did notice her, they assumed she spent her days tracking MREs and ammunition shipments, the unglamorous work that kept the base running but never made headlines. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell had another life. 3 nights a week, long after most personnel had turned in for the night, she would slip away to a restricted section of the airfield. There, under cover of darkness, she would climb into the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, the feared aircraft known to ground troops as the Warthog. For the past 18 months, she had been flying classified night missions, providing close air support to special operations teams operating deep in enemy territory. The deception hadn't been her idea. It came from the top, from generals who understood that sometimes the best weapon is the one nobody sees coming. Female pilots were still relatively rare in combat roles, and female A-10 pilots were rarer still. But Sarah had proven herself to be exceptional. During training at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, she had outperformed nearly every pilot in her class. Her instructors noticed something special. She had an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and an uncanny talent for precision strikes in chaotic environments. When the call came for volunteers for a classified program, Sarah didn't hesitate. They told her she would have to maintain a cover identity, that she would receive none of the recognition that usually came with combat missions, and that she would have to watch silently while others took credit for her work. She agreed without a second thought. For Sarah, flying wasn't about medals or glory. It was about saving lives and completing the mission. Her typical day started at 0600 hours with her logistics duties. She would meet with supply sergeants, review requisition forms, and coordinate with transport units. She became an expert in the mundane details that kept a forward operating base functional. She learned the names of every person in the supply chain, remembered birthdays, and always had time to help solve problems. People genuinely liked her, which made the deception easier. Nobody suspected that the helpful logistics officer who found them extra batteries or expedited their mail was secretly one of the deadliest pilots in the theater. The transformation happened in the late afternoon. Sarah would finish her logistics work, file her reports, and return to her quarters. There, she would try to sleep for a few hours before her real mission began. Sleep didn't always come easily. Sometimes she lay awake thinking about the young soldiers she had saved the night before, or the enemy fighters she had eliminated with the A-10's devastating 30mm Gu-8 Avenger cannon. The weapon could fire 3,900 rounds per minute, each one capable of destroying armored vehicles. Sarah had learned to use it with surgical precision. On this particular morning, Sarah was checking a shipment of vehicle parts when Major Tom Harrison approached. Harrison was the base operations officer, a career military man who had served 3 tours in Iraq before rotating to Afghanistan. He was respected by everyone on base, known for his fairness and competence. He nodded at Sarah as he walked past, barely acknowledging her presence. She had briefed him twice on supply issues, and both times he had looked at her like he was trying to remember if they had met before. Sarah didn't mind being forgettable. In fact, she cultivated it. She had learned early in her military career that being underestimated was an advantage. As a young lieutenant, male officers had often dismissed her opinions in planning sessions. She had watched them make mistakes she had predicted, then helped clean up the mess without pointing out that she had been right all along. Over time, she learned to use their assumptions against them. If they thought she was just a logistics officer, they would never see her coming. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. Sarah was reviewing fuel consumption reports when her radio crackled with an encrypted message. It was brief and coded, but She understood immediately. There was a mission that night, and it would be dangerous. A special operations team had been compromised deep in the mountains near the Pakistani border. They were surrounded and taking heavy fire. Standard air support was too far away, and the weather was deteriorating rapidly. They needed someone who could navigate through mountain valleys in the dark, someone who could deliver precise firepower in close proximity to friendly forces. They needed Sarah. She acknowledged the message with a simple click of her radio, then returned to her paperwork as if nothing had happened. Inside, her mind was already planning the mission. She mentally reviewed the terrain, calculated fuel requirements, and considered weapon loadouts. The A-10 could carry a devastating array of ordnance, but for this mission, she would need to be selective. Close air support in mountainous terrain required precision, not overwhelming firepower. As evening approached, Sarah went through her normal routine. She ate dinner in the mess hall, sitting alone with a book as she usually did. Other officers came and went, their conversations washing over her. Someone complained about the heat. Another talked about a video call with family back home. Nobody asked Sarah to join their table, and she preferred it that way. Invisibility was her greatest asset. At 2,200 hours, she returned to her quarters and changed into her flight suit. The transformation was physical and mental. The quiet logistics officer disappeared, replaced by a combat pilot with over 200 hours of close air support missions. She checked her gear with practiced efficiency: survival vest, helmet, gloves, weapon. Everything had its place, everything had a purpose. The walk to the restricted flight line took 15 minutes. Sarah moved through shadows, avoiding the main pathways where she might be seen. She had made this walk dozens of times and knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned and where their blind spots lay. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the daytime heat that could reach 120 degrees. The A-10 waiting for her on the tarmac was painted in dark colors with minimal markings. Unlike the standard Warthogs, this one had been modified for covert operations. The aircraft was a beast, designed around its massive cannon and built to take punishment. It wasn't fast or elegant, but it was effective. Pilots joked that the A-10 was so ugly it was beautiful, and Sarah had come to appreciate its brutal simplicity. She performed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care. Every rivet, every panel, every system had to be perfect. In combat, mechanical failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. She ran her hands along the aircraft's armor plating, thick titanium designed to protect the pilot from ground fire. The A-10 could survive direct hits that would destroy other aircraft, and Sarah had tested that capability more than once. Climbing into the cockpit felt like coming home. This was where she belonged, where everything made sense. The logistics office was her disguise, but this cockpit was her truth. She settled into the seat, connecting her harness and oxygen system, her hands moving through the startup sequence from muscle memory. The twin turbofan engines roared to life, their distinctive sound echoing across the airfield. The tower cleared her for takeoff using coded communications that wouldn't appear in official logs. As far as base records were concerned, there was no flight happening tonight. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the Warthog accelerate down the runway. Even fully loaded with weapons, the aircraft lifted off smoothly. She raised the landing gear and climbed into the darkness, leaving the lights of Bagram behind. Flying at night required different skills than daytime operations. Sarah relied on instruments and night vision, reading the terrain through technology rather than sight. The mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving, with peaks reaching over 20,000 feet and valleys that could trap an unwary pilot. She had studied this terrain for months, memorizing landmarks and emergency landing sites. The mission briefing had been minimal. A 6-man special operations team pinned down in a valley approximately 90 miles northeast of Bagram. Enemy fighters had them surrounded and were moving in for the kill. Conventional air support couldn't get there in time, and the terrain made helicopter extraction impossible until the enemy was neutralized. Sarah was their only hope. She pushed the A-10 to its maximum speed, though maximum for a Warthog was relatively modest compared to fighter jets. The aircraft topped out around 420 miles per hour, but it wasn't built for speed. It was built to loiter over battlefields, to absorb punishment, and to deliver devastating firepower with pinpoint accuracy. Sarah understood the aircraft's strengths and limitations intimately. As she approached the target area, she switched her radio to the frequency used by the Special Operations Team. Static filled her headset. Then, a voice broke through, tight with stress but professionally calm. The team leader, callsign Nomad 6, reported their situation. Approximately 40 enemy fighters had them surrounded in a narrow valley. The team had taken casualties and was running low on ammunition. They needed immediate air support or they wouldn't survive the night. Sarah acknowledged and began her approach. She descended into the valley, using night vision to navigate between the mountain peaks. The terrain was treacherous, with narrow passages and sudden elevation changes. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she would fly into a mountainside. But Sarah's focus was absolute. She had trained for scenarios exactly like this. Below her, she could see the thermal signatures of the firefight. The Special Operations Team had taken position behind a rocky outcrop, while enemy fighters were maneuvering to flank them from multiple directions. Sarah needed to eliminate the enemy without hitting friendly forces, a challenge made more difficult by darkness and terrain. She made her first pass high, using the A-10's targeting systems to mark enemy positions. The aircraft sensors could distinguish between friend and foe based on heat signatures and movement patterns. Sarah identified 3 enemy groups, one directly in front of the friendly position and 2 attempting to flank from the sides. She would need to eliminate all 3 groups to give the team a chance at survival. Banking hard, Sarah lined up her first attack run. She descended to 500 feet, low enough that she could hear small arms fire even over the sound of her engines. The enemy fighters below had no idea what was about to hit them. They had probably never seen an A-10 before, didn't know what the distinctive sound of its cannon meant. They were about to learn. Sarah squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 cannon roared to life. The sound was incredible, a deep, vibrating growl that earned the weapon its nickname, the burp gun. Depleted uranium rounds streaked toward the ground at 2,100 feet per second. The first enemy position simply ceased to exist, torn apart by the devastating firepower. She pulled up sharply, banking to line up her next run. Below, the enemy fighters were scattering, finally, realizing they were under attack from the air. But the narrow valley gave them nowhere to hide. Sarah came around again, this time targeting the left flank. Another burst from the cannon, another enemy position eliminated. The radio crackled with excitement. Nomad 6 reported that the pressure had eased, that they had a chance now. But Sarah wasn't done. She still had the right flank to clear, and she could see on her sensors that more enemy fighters were moving toward the valley, likely reinforcements responding to the sound of battle. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah worked the valley with deadly precision. She used the cannon for concentrated enemy positions and switched to rockets for scattered groups. Each attack run was calculated, each burst of fire precisely aimed. The Special Operations Team below watched in awe as the mysterious A-10 pilot systematically dismantled the enemy force that had been about to overrun them. Finally, Nomad 6 called that the valley was clear. The Survive in 6 weeks had passed since the Mountain Valley rescue, and Sarah had flown another dozen missions in that time. Each one was different, each one dangerous, and each one remained completely off the official record. She had become a ghost in the machine, a weapon that commanders could deploy without political complications or public scrutiny. The arrangement suited everyone involved, especially Sarah, who cared more about effectiveness than recognition. Her logistics duties had expanded during this time. Base Command, pleased with her apparent organizational skills, had assigned her additional responsibilities. She now coordinated supply operations for 3 forward operating bases in addition to Bagram. The workload was substantial, requiring early mornings and long days spent in meetings and reviewing paperwork. Sarah attacked these duties with the same dedication she brought to her flight missions. If she was going to maintain a cover identity, she would do it properly. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had joined the Air Force to fly, had fought to get into the A-10 program despite resistance from officers who didn't think women belonged in attack aircraft. She had proven herself repeatedly, earning top scores in training and demonstrating exceptional skill under pressure. Yet here she was, spending most of her time pushing paper and tracking inventory, hiding her true capabilities behind a facade of bureaucratic competence. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Sarah sat in a conference room with other logistics officers, discussing winter supply preparations. Afghanistan's winters were brutal, especially in the mountains where temperatures could drop well below freezing. The base needed to stockpile cold weather gear, heating fuel, and other essentials before the first snows arrived. The meeting was tedious, but necessary, the kind of mundane work that kept soldiers alive even if it never made headlines. Major Harrison led the meeting, methodically working through a checklist of items. Sarah contributed when asked, offering suggestions based on consumption data she had analyzed. Harrison nodded approvingly at her input, and she caught a flicker of surprise in his expression, as if he hadn't expected such thorough preparation from her. The other officers barely seemed to notice her presence at all. The meeting was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. A young lieutenant entered, looking flustered. He apologized for the intrusion, but said Major Harrison was needed immediately in the operations center. Harrison excused himself, leaving the logistics officers to continue without him. Sarah caught the lieutenant's expression as he left. This wasn't a routine matter. Something significant was happening. She forced herself to remain focused on the meeting even as curiosity gnawed at her. Whatever was happening in the operations center, it wasn't her concern during daylight hours. Captain Mitchell, logistics officer, had no business involving herself in operational matters. That was someone else's job, someone else's world. The meeting concluded an hour later. Sarah gathered her notes and returned to her office, a small space she shared with a supplies sergeant named Rodriguez. Rodriguez was a career enlisted man with 20 years of service, a wealth of practical knowledge, and a talent for acquiring difficult-to-find items through unofficial channels. He and Sarah had developed a good working relationship built on mutual respect and shared dedication to keeping the base supplied. Rodriguez was on the phone when Sarah entered, his expression serious. He finished his call and looked at her with concern. Something big was happening, he told her. There had been a major attack on a convoy heading to FOB Lightning, one of the forward operating bases Sarah coordinated supplies for. Multiple casualties, vehicles destroyed, and now the base was potentially under siege. Enemy forces had been gathering in the area for weeks, and it seemed they had finally made their move. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into tactical mode, though she was careful not to let it show. She asked Rodriguez what he knew about the situation. The details were still coming in, but it appeared that a large enemy force had ambushed the convoy and was now moving on FOB Lightning itself. The base had maybe 150 personnel, mostly support troops with limited combat training. They were designed to provide logistics support, not repel a major assault. The implications were clear. FOB Lightning was undermanned, undersupplied for a prolonged fight, and probably calling desperately for air support. Standard response time for fighter jets from Bagram was at least 30 minutes, and conventional close air support aircraft might take even longer. In 30 minutes, a lot of soldiers could die. Sarah excused herself and walked to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall. She pulled out her secure phone, the one issued specifically for her covert missions, and sent a brief, encrypted message to her handlers. 2 words, Lightning. Available. Then, she flushed the toilet, washed her hands, and returned to her office as if nothing had happened. The response came 15 minutes later, a vibration in her pocket that meant she had a coded message. She waited until Rodriguez left for lunch before checking it. The message was brief: standby. Developing situation. Possible green light within 2 hours. Sarah deleted the message and slipped the phone back into her pocket. 2 hours. She would need to maintain her cover until then, continue with her logistics duties while mentally preparing for a mission. The afternoon crawled by. Sarah processed requisition forms and coordinated with transport units, all while monitoring radio chatter about FOB Lightning. The news wasn't good. The convoy had been destroyed with significant casualties. The survivors had made it back to the base, but enemy forces were now surrounding the perimeter. Initial estimates suggested maybe 200 fighters, heavily armed and determined. FOB Lightning was requesting immediate air support and reinforcements. Sarah knew the response would be complicated. Sending ground reinforcements would take time and risk another ambush. Air support was the obvious answer, but FOB Lightning was located in a difficult area. The base sat in a valley surrounded by hills where enemy fighters could position anti-aircraft weapons. Any aircraft flying support would be vulnerable, especially helicopters. The A-10, however, was built for exactly this kind of scenario. Its armor could survive hits from small arms and even some anti-aircraft fire. Its cannon and missiles could suppress enemy positions in the hills, and its ability to fly low and slow meant it could provide sustained support rather than just a quick strike. Sarah was confident she could make a difference if they would let her fly. At 1,430 hours, her phone buzzed again. This time the message was longer. Green light. Launch 1,600. Full ordnance. ROE Charlie. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Rules of engagement Charlie meant she had broad authority to engage enemy targets, with the understanding that friendly forces were in close proximity. It also meant the situation was desperate enough that Command was willing to risk exposure of the covert program. She had 90 minutes to prepare. Sarah finished the paperwork on her desk, filed everything properly, and told Rodriguez she wasn't feeling well and was going to her quarters to rest. He expressed concern and told her to take care of herself. She managed a weak smile and left, feeling guilty about the deception but knowing it was necessary. In her quarters, Sarah transformed once again from logistics officer to combat pilot. She reviewed satellite imagery of FOB Lightning on her secure tablet, studying the terrain and enemy positions. Intelligence had identified multiple fighting positions in the hills surrounding the base, with heavy weapons that could threaten aircraft. The enemy was dug in and prepared for a prolonged siege. Sarah plotted her approach carefully. She would come in from the north, using a mountain ridge for cover until the last possible moment. Her first priority would be suppressing the anti-aircraft positions, clearing the way for other support aircraft. Then, she could focus on the enemy fighters surrounding the base perimeter. It would be dangerous, requiring her to fly within range of enemy weapons while eliminating them. But the A-10 was designed for this kind of close-quarters battle. At 1,545 hours, she made her way to the restricted flight line. The ground crew had the A-10 ready, armed with a full load of munitions, AGM-65 Maverick missiles for hardened targets, Hydra rockets for area suppression, and a full ammunition load for the 30mm cannon. The aircraft bristled with weapons, every hardpoint loaded. This wasn't a precision strike mission. This was all-out combat. Sarah completed her pre-flight faster than usual, urgency overriding her typical methodical pace. Every minute counted now. Soldiers at FOB Lightning were fighting for their lives, and she was their lifeline. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and ran through the startup sequence. The engines roared to life, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. Tower clearance came immediately. The tower controller's voice was tense, and Sarah could hear the stress in the clipped words. Everyone at Bagram knew what was happening at FOB Lightning, even if they didn't know about Sarah's mission. She acknowledged clearance and taxied to the runway, not bothering with the usual careful pre-takeoff checks. Time was more valuable than caution right now. The Warthog surged down the runway, heavy with weapons but still lifting smoothly. Sarah retracted the landing gear and climbed quickly, turning northeast toward FOB Lightning. The flight time would be approximately 25 minutes at maximum speed. She used the time to review her attack plan, visualizing each pass and calculating ammunition expenditure. The radio crackled with transmissions from FOB Lightning. The base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, was coordinating the defense with remarkable calm given the circumstances. Sarah had met Webb once during a supply inspection, and he had struck her as competent but unimaginative. Now she was hearing a different side of him, a commander holding together a desperate defense through force of will and tactical skill. Webb's situation reports painted a grim picture. Enemy forces had breached the outer perimeter in 2 places. His troops were falling back to secondary positions, but ammunition was running low. He had casualties mounting and limited medical supplies. Air support was promised, but still minutes away. Sarah wanted to break radio silence and tell him help was closer than he knew. But maintaining operational security was paramount. As she approached FOB Lightning, Sarah descended to 200 feet, using the terrain to mask her approach. The hills around the base were perfect cover, allowing her to navigate undetected until she was almost on top of the enemy positions. She armed her weapons systems and focused her sensors on the target area. The view through her targeting display was sobering. FOB Lightning was completely surrounded, with enemy fighters visible in multiple positions around the perimeter. Tracer fires streaked back and forth as defenders and attackers exchanged shots. She could see the base's defensive positions being systematically suppressed by enemy fire from the hills. If something didn't change soon, the base would fall. Sarah identified her first target, an enemy position on a hilltop with what appeared to be a heavy machine gun and possibly anti-aircraft weapons. The position commanded the northern approach to the base and was pouring fire onto the defenders below. She armed a Maverick missile, locked onto the target, and fired. The missile streaked from under her wing, covering the distance in seconds. The hilltop erupted in flame and debris as the 125-pound warhead detonated. The enemy position ceased to exist, and, suddenly, the northern section of FOB Lightning's perimeter had breathing room. Sarah banked hard, already lining up her next target. Another enemy position, this one on the eastern ridge. Another Maverick, another explosion. She worked methodically, using missiles to eliminate the prepared defensive positions that posed the greatest threat to both the base and her aircraft. The enemy fighters realized they were under air attack, and the nature of the battle changed instantly. Some scattered for cover, while others turned their weapons skyward, trying to target the A-10. Sarah saw tracer fire reaching toward her and felt the aircraft shudder as a few rounds impacted the armored hull. The hits were inconsequential, barely scratching the titanium bathtub that protected her cockpit. Now she switched to the cannon. Sarah dove toward a group of enemy fighters moving on the western perimeter, the Gu-8 spinning up with its distinctive sound. The 30mm rounds tore through vehicles and fighting positions with devastating effect. She pulled up sharply, banking to avoid a hill, and immediately rolled into another attack run. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah fought one of the most intense battles of her career. She made pass after pass, using every weapon in her arsenal. Missiles for hardened targets, rockets for groups of fighters, and the cannon for everything else. The A-10 absorbed hits from small arms fire, and even what might have been a rocket-propelled grenade that detonated near her tail. But the tough aircraft kept flying. The radio traffic from FOB Lightning changed from desperate to hopeful. Webb's voice took on new energy as he reported enemy forces breaking contact and retreating. The pressure on his perimeter eased, then collapsed entirely as enemy fighters abandoned their positions and fled into the hills. Sarah continued to pursue them, making sure they understood that staying anywhere near FOB Lightning meant death. Finally, Webb called that the base was secure. Enemy forces had withdrawn, leaving behind weapons and casualties. The siege was broken. Sarah acknowledged with a simple click of her radio, not trusting herself to speak. Her voice would give away too much. The emotion, the relief, the exhaustion. She climbed back to safe altitude and circled the base, confirming the area was clear. Below, she could see soldiers emerging from defensive positions, some helping wounded comrades, others securing the perimeter. They had survived, and they would live to see another day. That was all that mattered. The flight back to Bagram was longer than the outbound journey. Sarah had pushed the A-10 hard, burning through fuel at a prodigious rate. She calculated that she had maybe 15 minutes of flying time remaining when she finally spotted Bagram's runway lights. The landing was routine, though her hands shook slightly on the controls from exhaustion and adrenaline come down. The aftermath of the FOB Lightning rescue created unexpected complications for Sarah's cover identity. Word spread quickly through Bagram about the mysterious A-10 pilot who had single-handedly broken the siege and saved the base. Soldiers who had been at Lightning returned to Bagram with stories of the devastating air support that had appeared when all seemed lost. The rumor mill churned with speculation about who had flown the mission. Sarah listened to these conversations with carefully maintained disinterest. In the mess hall, at supply meetings, during routine inspections, she heard people discussing the mystery pilot. Some claimed it had been a visiting pilot from another base. Others insisted it was a classified special operations unit. A few even suggested it might have been a female pilot, though these suggestions were usually met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Major Harrison, who had been at FOB Lightning during the siege, became particularly animated when discussing the mission. Sarah sat through a logistics briefing where Harrison spent 20 minutes describing the battle in vivid detail. He talked about the precision of the strikes, the perfect timing of each attack run, and the pilot's apparent intimate knowledge of close air support tactics. He called it the finest display of A-10 combat flying he had ever witnessed. Sarah kept her expression neutral, making occasional notes about supply requirements while Harrison spoke. Inside, she felt a complex mixture of pride and frustration. Pride that her work was recognized, even if anonymously. Frustration that she couldn't acknowledge it, couldn't explain that every one of those perfect attack runs had been the result of months of training and dozens of previous missions. She was becoming a legend, but legends were anonymous and invisible. The increased attention made her work more difficult. Security protocols around the covert program tightened. Sarah's handlers worried that too much speculation might lead someone to start asking the wrong questions. They instituted new procedures. Mission briefings moved to different times, flight patterns changed, and ground crew rotations became more frequent. The goal was to eliminate any pattern that might be noticed by an observant person. Sarah adapted to the new requirements without complaint. If anything, the heightened security made her more committed to maintaining her cover. She threw herself into logistics work with renewed dedication, often working late into the evening on supply reports and inventory management. She became known as someone who could solve difficult problems, who always had time to help, and who never sought credit or recognition. The perfect bureaucrat, utterly forgettable except for her reliability. 3 weeks after the FOB Lightning mission, Sarah received an unusual assignment. A visiting general from Pentagon was conducting an inspection tour of Afghan bases, and someone needed to brief him on logistics operations at Bagram. Typically, this would fall to Major Harrison or one of the senior logistics officers, but Harrison was deployed to a forward base and others were tied up with critical projects. By process of elimination, the task fell to Sarah. She prepared meticulously for the briefing, assembling detailed reports on supply chains, consumption rates, and efficiency improvements. Sarah knew that general officers, especially those from Pentagon, could ask penetrating questions. She needed to demonstrate complete mastery of her cover role. Any hint of divided attention or incomplete knowledge could raise suspicions. The general arrived on a Thursday morning. Brigadier General Robert Chun was a logistics specialist himself, with a reputation for innovative thinking about military supply chains. Sarah had researched his background and knew he had written several papers on improving efficiency in forward operating environments. This wasn't going to be a perfunctory briefing. Chun would actually engage with the material. They met in a conference room at 1000 hours. Sarah set up her presentation, arranging charts and graphs on the table. Chun arrived exactly on time, accompanied by an aide and Colonel Patricia Reeves, the base commander. Sarah stood at attention as they entered, and Chun waved her to ease before taking a seat. The briefing lasted 90 minutes. Sarah walked General Chun through every aspect of Bagram's logistics operation, from fuel storage to medical supplies. She explained the challenges of maintaining supply lines in a combat environment, the creative solutions her team had implemented, and the measurable improvements in efficiency over the past year. Chun asked detailed questions, and Sarah answered each one with confidence and precision. What impressed Chun most, according to his comments, was Sarah's understanding of the connection between logistics and combat effectiveness. She didn't just see supplies as numbers on a spreadsheet. She understood how timely delivery of the right materials could mean the difference between mission success and failure, between casualties and safe returns. Chun nodded approvingly as Sarah explained how she had prioritized certain shipments based on operational tempo and anticipated needs. Near the end of the briefing, Chun asked an unexpected question. He wanted to know about her career goals, where she saw herself in 5 years. Sarah felt a moment of panic, carefully hidden behind her professional demeanor. The truthful answer would expose everything. She wanted to be acknowledged as a combat pilot, to fly missions without hiding, to receive the recognition she had earned. But that answer was impossible. Instead, she gave a carefully prepared response. Sarah said she enjoyed logistics work and found satisfaction in supporting combat operations from behind the scenes. She mentioned the possibility of advanced training in supply chain management, perhaps a staff position at a larger command. It was a safe, boring answer that fit perfectly with her cover identity. Chen seemed satisfied with the response, though Sarah thought she detected a flicker of something in his expression. Disappointment, perhaps? Or skepticism? The moment passed quickly, and Chen thanked her for an excellent briefing. Colonel Reeves added her compliments, noting that Sarah had represented Bagram well. They left, and Sarah was alone with her thoughts and a nagging worry that she had somehow revealed too much or too little. That worry intensified later that afternoon when Sarah received a summons to Colonel Reeves's office. Summons were unusual. Normally, Reeves communicated through email or at staff meetings. Sarah walked across the base with growing anxiety, mentally reviewing every aspect of the briefing for potential mistakes. Reeves's office was Spartan, decorated only with military citations and a few family photos. The colonel sat behind her desk, reviewing a file when Sarah entered. Reeves looked up and gestured for Sarah to sit. The colonel's expression was unreadable, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase despite her training in maintaining calm under pressure. Reeves began by complimenting Sarah on the briefing. General Chun had been impressed, and that reflected well on Bagram. Then, Reeves paused, choosing her next words carefully. She said that Chun had asked an interesting question after the briefing ended. He wanted to know if Bagram had any pilots assigned to logistics duties, anyone with flight training who was working in supply operations. Sarah's mind raced. This was dangerous territory. She maintained eye contact with Reeves and said that she wasn't aware of any pilots in logistics positions at Bagram. It was technically true. Her flight status was so classified that it didn't appear in standard personnel records. As far as official Bagram assignments were concerned, she was purely a logistics officer. Reeves nodded slowly, her eyes searching Sarah's face. She mentioned that Chun had a theory about the FOB Lightning rescue mission. He believed the pilot who flew that mission must have extensive knowledge of logistics operations, based on the way they had coordinated with ground forces and understood supply line vulnerabilities. Chen thought the pilot might have a background in both combat aviation and logistics support. Sarah felt ice in her veins, but kept her expression neutral. She said it sounded like an interesting theory and that General Chun was known for his analytical thinking. Reeves agreed, then added that Chun had requested personnel files for everyone in the logistics section. Standard procedure for his inspection tour, nothing unusual. The files would be prepared and sent to him within the week. The colonel dismissed Sarah with thanks for her time. Sarah left the office walking at a normal pace, though every instinct screamed at her to run. This was the nightmare scenario her handlers had warned about. A senior officer with analytical skills and the authority to access records starting to put pieces together. If Chen looked closely enough at her file, he might notice inconsistencies. Her cover story was solid, but not impenetrable. She returned to her quarters and sent an encrypted message to her handlers. Potential compromise. Senior officer requesting files. Recommend immediate review. The response came within an hour. Acknowledged. Maintaining cover. File sanitized. Continue normal operations. Sarah felt marginally better knowing that her handlers were aware and taking precautions, but the anxiety remained. The next few days were tense. Sarah continued her logistics duties while constantly watching for signs that her cover was blown. She attended meetings, processed requisitions, and coordinated shipments, all while maintaining heightened awareness of her surroundings. Every unexpected question felt like a probe, every prolonged glance like suspicion. Her secure phone remained silent. No missions were assigned, which was unusual. Typically, she flew 2 or 3 times per week, but now a full week passed without any calls. Sarah wondered if the program had been suspended due to the security concerns or if her handlers were simply being extra cautious. On the 8th day after General Chen's visit, Sarah was working late in her office when Rodriguez appeared at the door. He looked concerned and said there was someone who wanted to speak with her. Before Sarah could ask who, General Chun himself stepped into the small office. Sarah immediately stood at attention. Chun waved her to ease and looked around the cramped space with obvious interest. He noted the organization, the efficiency of the setup, the attention to detail visible in how supplies were tracked and managed. Then, he turned his full attention to Sarah, and she felt like she was being x-rayed with his gaze. Chun said he had spent the past week reviewing operations at Bagram and other bases in Afghanistan. He had looked at efficiency metrics, spoken with personnel, and examined numerous files and reports. What he had found was interesting. Bagram's logistics operation was significantly more efficient than comparable bases, with fewer supply disruptions and better anticipation of operational needs. The improvement coincided almost exactly with Sarah's assignment to the base. Sarah thanked him for the compliment, but began to credit her team and the support of senior leadership. Chun cut her off gently. He wasn't finished. He had also noticed something else interesting. The mysterious A-10 pilot who had been conducting covert missions throughout the region demonstrated an unusual understanding of logistics operations. The pilot knew exactly where friendly forces would be, understood their supply situations, and coordinated attacks in ways that maximized operational efficiency. The general paused, letting the implications hang in the air. Sarah maintained her composure, though her mind was calculating options. Deny everything? Claim ignorance? Wait to see where Chun was going with this. Chun made the decision for her. He said he had been a logistics officer for 25 years before making general. He understood the mindset, the attention to detail, the way a good logistics officer thought about problems. He had also been a pilot early in his career, before an injury grounded him permanently. He knew what it meant to love flying, to feel incomplete without it. The general sat down in the chair across from Sarah's desk, an informal gesture that broke the tension slightly. He said he had reviewed her file very carefully. On the surface, it showed a competent logistics officer with no flight training or aviation background. But files could be sanitized, records could be adjusted, and sometimes the most interesting information was what wasn't included rather than what was. Sarah felt her cover crumbling but maintained her discipline. She thanked General Chun for his interest in her work, but said she wasn't sure what he was implying. Chun smiled slightly, a knowing expression that acknowledged the game they were playing. He said he wasn't going to push for confirmation or denial. He understood that some operations required discretion, that some warriors did their work in shadows. But he wanted her to know something. If she was the pilot everyone was talking about, the one who had saved FOB Lightning and conducted countless other missions, then she was doing extraordinary work. The kind of work that changed outcomes and saved lives. Chun stood to leave, but paused at the door. He said that sometimes the most effective warriors were the ones nobody suspected. The ones who could hide in plain sight while making crucial contributions to the mission. He hoped she would continue her excellent work in logistics. And if she happened to have any other duties, he hoped she would excel at those as well. After he left, Sarah sat motionless for several minutes. The conversation had been carefully ambiguous, structured so that neither party committed to anything specific. But the message was clear. Chun had figured it out, or at least suspected strongly enough to matter. The question was what he would do with that knowledge. Her secure phone buzzed. The message was brief. Chun cleared. Aware of program. Continue operations. Sarah exhaled deeply, feeling tension drain from her body. Chun wasn't a threat. He was read into the program. Probably had been before he ever arrived at Bagram. The whole inspection tour might have been cover for checking on the covert operation. She realized she had just been tested. Not by an enemy, but by her own command structure. They had wanted to see how she would handle pressure, how well she could maintain her cover when questioned by someone who clearly suspected the truth. She had passed the test by giving nothing away, maintaining her role even when it would winter descended on Afghanistan with brutal efficiency. Temperatures plummeted, snow blanketed the mountains, and flying conditions became treacherous. Sarah's logistics workload increased dramatically as bases scrambled to maintain adequate supplies of heating fuel, cold weather gear, and other winter essentials. She worked 16-hour days coordinating emergency shipments, troubleshooting frozen equipment, and managing the constant crisis that came with Afghan winters. Her flight missions became less frequent, but more dangerous. Ice could form on aircraft surfaces, reducing performance and creating hazards. Visibility dropped in snowstorms that swept through the mountains with little warning. The A-10 was tough, but even the Warthog had limits in extreme weather. Sarah studied meteorology reports obsessively, looking for windows of opportunity when missions could be flown safely. The reduced operational tempo gave Sarah time to reflect on her double life. She had been in Afghanistan for 14 months now, with 6 months remaining on her deployment. In that time, she had flown 83 combat missions without a single loss of friendly forces in operations she supported. The statistics were impressive, though only a handful of people knew they existed. Rodriguez had noticed the change in Sarah during the winter months. She seemed more introspective, quieter than usual. One evening, as they worked late processing a shipment of generator parts, he asked if she was okay. Sarah assured him she was fine, just tired from the workload. Rodriguez nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. He mentioned that sometimes the hardest part of deployment wasn't the danger, but the isolation, the feeling of being disconnected from normal life. His words struck deeper than he knew. Sarah was isolated in ways Rodriguez couldn't imagine. She couldn't share her real work with anyone at Bagram except a handful of cleared personnel. She couldn't discuss her missions with other pilots, couldn't seek advice or share experiences. Every flight was a solitary burden, carried alone. Even her family back home believed she spent her days managing supplies, safely away from combat. In late December, Sarah received an encrypted message that changed everything. Command was planning a major operation for January, one that would require significant air support, including multiple A-10 missions. More importantly, they were considering bringing Sarah out of the shadows. The operation would be high-profile enough that hiding the identity of pilots would be difficult, and Command felt the program had proven its value. They wanted to know if Sarah was willing to be publicly acknowledged as a combat pilot. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. This was what she had wanted since joining the Air Force: recognition as a combat pilot, the ability to own her accomplishments, an end to the constant deception. But she also understood what she would be giving up. The covert program allowed her to operate with minimal oversight, to take missions that conventional pilots couldn't fly, to make a difference in ways that public operations never could. She requested 24 hours to consider before responding. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah walked around the perimeter of Bagram. The base was quiet under a blanket of snow, with only guards and night shift personnel visible. She thought about FOB Lightning, about the Special Operations Team in the Mountain Valley, about dozens of other missions where her intervention had meant the difference between success and failure, life and death. If she went public, she would lose that flexibility. She would become known, recognizable, subject to all the limitations and protocols that came with conventional operations. She would get credit for her work, but she would also lose the ability to do certain kinds of work. The question was which mattered more, recognition or effectiveness. By morning, Sarah had made her decision. She sent her response, request to remain covert. Current program provides unique operational capabilities. Personal recognition secondary to mission effectiveness. The reply came quickly, acknowledged and approved. Your dedication noted at highest levels. Sarah felt at peace with the decision. She didn't need medals or public acclaim. She needed to fly, to make a difference, to use her skills where they mattered most. If that meant remaining in the shadows, so be it. The Major Operation Command had mentioned took shape in early January. It was called Operation Mountain Thunder, designed to clear enemy forces from a strategic valley system that had been a Taliban stronghold for years. The operation would involve multiple NATO forces, hundreds of ground troops, and extensive air support. Sarah's role would be critical, providing close air support for special operations teams that would infiltrate ahead of the main force. The planning process was intense. Sarah participated in mission briefings while maintaining her logistics cover. She would attend operations meetings as a logistics officer, contributing expertise on supply requirements. Then, separately receive detailed tactical briefings about her flight missions. The dual roles required constant mental compartmentalization. Major Harrison noticed Sarah at one of the operations meetings and seemed surprised to see her there. He asked what logistics had to do with tactical planning. Sarah explained smoothly that ground operations required supply support, and She needed to understand the operational timeline to coordinate deliveries effectively. Harrison accepted the explanation without question, and Sarah made a mental note to be more careful about when and where she appeared. Operation Mountain Thunder was scheduled for January 15th, weather permitting. Sarah spent the preceding week studying the terrain in obsessive detail. The valley system was complex, with multiple branches and numerous places where enemy forces could establish defensive positions. The special operations teams would be inserting at night, moving to positions before the main assault began. Sarah would be their guardian angel, ready to respond if they encountered resistance. The night before the operation, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk running through scenarios, visualizing attack runs, calculating ammunition expenditure. This would be her most complex mission yet, potentially involving multiple teams across a wide geographic area. She would need to be everywhere at once, ready to respond to threats while conserving fuel and ammunition for the entire operation. At 0300 hours on January 15th, Sarah suited up and made her way to the flight line. The A-10 was loaded for bear, maximum ammunition for the cannon, a full complement of missiles and rockets, and extra fuel tanks. The aircraft was so heavy that takeoff would be marginal, but she would need every pound of ordnance for what was coming. The special operations teams inserted on schedule dropped into the valley by helicopters that quickly departed. Sarah circled high overhead, monitoring radio traffic as the teams moved into position. Everything was quiet for the first hour. The teams reported reaching their objectives without contact. It seemed the enemy was either absent or maintaining discipline, waiting to see what developed. Then, at 0517 hours, everything went wrong. One of the special operations teams, callsign Razor 2, triggered an ambush. Enemy forces opened fire from multiple positions, and Razor 2 found themselves pinned down with casualties. The team leader called urgently for air support, providing coordinates for enemy positions. Sarah was already diving toward the valley before the request finished. She had been expecting this, had positioned herself for quick response. The A-10 descended through the darkness, Sarah's hands steady on the controls despite the urgency of the situation. Below, tracer fire marked the firefight, enemy and friendly positions revealed by muzzle flashes. She made her first pass with rockets, suppressing the nearest enemy position. The explosions lit up the valley, and Sarah could see the full scope of the ambush. Razor 2 was surrounded, taking fire from at least 3 sides. She would need to work fast and precisely to break them free without hitting friendly forces. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew one of the most intense close air support missions of her career. She made pass after pass, each one threading the needle between helping Razor 2 and avoiding friendly fire incidents. The 30mm cannon sang its deadly song, rockets streaked into enemy positions, and gradually the pressure on Razor 2 eased. But the gunfire that triggered Razor 2's ambush had alerted other enemy forces in the valley. Sarah's radio lit up with calls from other teams reporting contact. Razor 3 was taking sporadic fire from a hilltop. Razor 4 had spotted enemy reinforcements moving toward their position. Suddenly, Sarah was needed in 3 places at once. She made rapid decisions, prioritizing based on threat level and proximity. Razor 2 was stabilized but still needed cover while they evacuated casualties. Razor 3 could handle their situation with minimal support. Razor 4 needed immediate help to prevent being overrun. Sarah raced across the valley, engaging targets at Razor 4's location, then circling back to check on Razor 2. The operation that was supposed to achieve surprise had turned into a running gun battle across the entire valley system. Sarah flew for 3 straight hours, refueling once from a tanker that met her at high altitude, then immediately returning to the fight. She burned through ammunition at a prodigious rate, making every shot count as she juggled multiple teams and constantly shifting priorities. As dawn broke, Sarah was running on fumes both literally and figuratively. Her fuel was low, her ammunition nearly exhausted, and she was operating on adrenaline and willpower. But the special operations teams were all secure, casualties evacuated, and the main assault force was moving into position. The critical phase was over, and they had survived. Sarah turned toward Bagram, too tired to feel relief. She landed with minimum fuel, the gauge reading almost empty. The ground crew looked at the aircraft in amazement. It was riddled with bullet holes, panels damaged, one landing gear strut showing stress fractures. The A-10 had taken a beating, but brought her home one more time. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Sarah provided detailed accounts of every engagement, every decision, every target. Intelligence officers were particularly interested in enemy positions and capabilities. The special operations teams had gathered valuable information, but Sarah's observations from the air provided a broader picture. Together, they were building a comprehensive understanding of enemy forces in the valley. When the debrief finally ended, Sarah was released with instructions to get some rest. She made it back to her quarters and collapsed on her bunk, still in her flight suit. Sleep claimed her instantly, deep and dreamless. She woke 12 hours later to find the base buzzing with activity. Operation Mountain Thunder's main assault was underway, and it was going well. The Special Operations Team's intelligence, combined with Sarah's suppression of enemy positions, had given conventional forces a significant advantage. The valley was being cleared systematically, with lighter resistance than anticipated. Sarah showered and changed into her regular uniform, transforming back into the logistics officer. She had missed an entire day of work, and there would be consequences for that. She made her way to the supply office, preparing explanations for her absence. Rodriguez was there, looking concerned. He asked where she had been, if she was okay. Sarah claimed she had been sick, severe stomach issues, spent the whole day in her quarters. Rodriguez seemed to accept the story, though he mentioned that she looked exhausted. The next few days were a blur of logistics work, and Recovery March brought changes to Afghanistan and to Sarah's deployment. The Taliban had shifted their tactics following Operation Mountain Thunder, avoiding large concentrations that made them vulnerable to air attack. Instead, they operated in small groups, striking quickly and melting away before coalition forces could respond. This new approach made Sarah's missions both more frequent and more challenging. She often flew multiple times per night, responding to scattered contacts across a wide area. Her logistics duties evolved as well. Sarah was promoted to major in early March, a recognition of her apparent excellence in supply chain management. The promotion came with increased responsibilities. She now coordinated logistics operations for an entire sector, managing supply flows to 8 different bases. The workload was enormous, but Sarah had learned to operate on minimal sleep and maximum efficiency. The promotion ceremony was small and unremarkable. Colonel Reeves pinned the new rank insignia on Sarah's uniform while a handful of logistics officers watched. There were handshakes and congratulations, a brief reception with cake and coffee. Sarah smiled and thanked everyone appropriately, maintaining her role as the dedicated logistics professional. Nobody mentioned the other promotion she had received, the classified one that recognized her as one of the most effective close air support pilots in theater. Rodriguez had been particularly pleased about Sarah's promotion. He told her she deserved it, that her work had transformed logistics operations at Bagram and beyond. Sarah felt a pang of guilt at his genuine happiness for her success, knowing that her logistics achievements were secondary to her real mission. But Rodriguez's friendship mattered to her, and she appreciated his support even if he would never know the full truth. April brought an unexpected visitor to Bagram. Colonel James Mitchell arrived on temporary assignment to review and improve air operations coordination. When Sarah saw the name on the visitor roster, her heart skipped. Mitchell was her father, a career Air Force officer currently stationed at the Pentagon. They had agreed before her deployment that they would avoid any special recognition of their relationship to prevent complications or accusations of favoritism. Their first encounter happened in the mess hall. Sarah was eating breakfast when her father entered, accompanied by Colonel Reeves and other senior officers. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Sarah saw the pride in his expression before he looked away. They were both professionals, both committed to the mission, and both understood that some sacrifices were necessary. Later that day, Sarah was summoned to a meeting about air-ground coordination. She entered the conference room to find her father presenting analysis of close air support operations. Colonel Mitchell was discussing the mysterious A-10 pilot whose missions had become the subject of extensive study. He presented data showing remarkable efficiency, Minimal ammunition expenditure per target destroyed, extremely low rates of collateral damage, and perfect coordination with ground forces. Sarah sat through the presentation, maintaining her neutral expression, though inside, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Her father was analyzing her work without acknowledging their connection, praising her effectiveness without revealing he knew exactly who was flying those missions. It was professionalism at its finest, and also heartbreaking in its way. The presentation concluded with Colonel Mitchell recommending that the Air Force study the mystery pilot's techniques and incorporate them into training programs. He suggested that whoever was flying these missions represented the gold standard for close air support, and those skills should be captured and shared. Sarah made a note on her pad, as if this information was merely interesting rather than personally relevant. After the meeting, Sarah's father requested a brief private conversation with her. They stepped into an empty office, and, for a moment, the professional facade dropped. He looked at her with a father's concern and pride, asking quietly if she was okay, if she was taking care of herself. Sarah assured him she was fine, that she was managing both her duties successfully. He nodded, then added something that surprised her. He said he understood better now what she was doing, the choice she had made to remain covert. When she first volunteered for the program, he had worried that she was accepting an assignment that would deny her the recognition she deserved. But, after reviewing her missions, seeing the operational impact she was having, he realized she had made the right choice. Some warriors served best from the shadows, and she was proving to be exceptional at it. Sarah felt tears threatening, but maintained her composure. She thanked him for understanding, for supporting her even when he couldn't acknowledge it publicly. They had perhaps 2 minutes of honesty before they needed to return to their professional roles. It was enough. When they emerged from the office, they were once again Colonel Mitchell and Major Mitchell, 2 Air Force officers who happened to share a last name. That night, Sarah flew a mission that would test everything she had learned. Intelligence had located a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces. The commander was meeting with other leaders in a compound in a heavily populated area. The mission required surgical precision. Any mistakes could result in civilian casualties and create a propaganda victory for the enemy. Sarah studied the target imagery for hours before takeoff. The compound was surrounded by civilian homes, schools, and a mosque. The margins for error were non-existent. She would have one chance to strike the target without causing collateral damage. Conventional air support would never be authorized for such a mission, the risks were too high. But Sarah had proven her precision repeatedly, and command trusted her to make it work. The flight to the target area was tense. Sarah ran through her attack plan repeatedly, visualizing the approach angle, calculating the exact moment to fire. She would use the cannon rather than missiles, relying on precision rather than explosive power. The 30mm rounds would penetrate the target building while minimizing damage to surrounding structures. As she approached the compound, Sarah saw the challenge clearly. The target building was in the center of a dense urban area. Civilians were visible on nearby streets even at this late hour. Any deviation from her planned trajectory, any miscalculation of distance or timing, could result in disaster. Sarah made her approach at low altitude, using terrain features to mask her presence until the last moment. The A-10's targeting system locked onto the building, calculating wind, distance, and trajectory. Sarah took a breath, steadied her hands, and fired a controlled burst from the cannon. The rounds impacted exactly where she had aimed them, tearing through the roof of the target building. Sarah pulled up sharply, banking away from the area. Below, she could see the building collapsing inward, the structure compromised by the precision strike. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition or explosives had been stored inside, confirming this was indeed a Taliban stronghold. But what mattered most was what didn't happen. The surrounding buildings remained intact. No fire spread to civilian homes. The strike had been clean, surgical, exactly as required. Sarah circled once to confirm damage assessment, then turned toward home. The mission had been successful without any collateral damage, a testament to months of experience and thousands of hours of training. The debrief the next morning was conducted by her father, along with Colonel Reeves and intelligence officers. Colonel Mitchell reviewed the strike footage with obvious satisfaction. He noted the precision, the restraint, the perfect execution of an extremely difficult mission. Without naming Sarah, he said the pilot had demonstrated the highest standards of professional skill and judgment. Sarah sat through the debrief, providing logistics perspective, discussing the ammunition expenditure and fuel consumption as if she hadn't been the one who made those calculations in real time. Her father maintained perfect professional distance, never once indicating their relationship or that he knew she was the pilot being discussed. May brought news that Sarah's deployment was nearing its end. She would rotate back to the United States in early June, concluding what had been an extraordinary 18 months in Afghanistan. The announcement brought mixed feelings. She was ready to see her family, to return to normal life. But she also knew that her unique operational role would end with this deployment. Command offered her a choice. She could return to conventional flight operations, receive public recognition for her combat service, and move forward with a traditional career path. Or she could remain with the covert program, potentially deploying to other theaters where similar operations were needed. The decision was hers. Sarah spent her final weeks in Afghanistan wrestling with this choice. She flew her last missions with particular attention, knowing each one might be her final flight in the A-10. She continued her logistics work with dedication, ensuring a smooth transition to her replacement. And she thought deeply about what kind of pilot and officer she wanted to be. The answer came during her final mission. Sarah was providing overwatch for a convoy moving through a dangerous area when they were ambushed. The attack was coordinated and deadly, with enemy fighters using tactics that suggested significant training. The convoy was in serious trouble, taking casualties and unable to maneuver out of the kill zone. Sarah responded with everything she had learned over 18 months of combat flying. She didn't just suppress the ambush, she systematically dismantled it. She anticipated enemy movements, predicted their tactics, and eliminated threats before they could fully develop. The convoy commander later reported that it was the finest display of close air support he had ever witnessed, that the pilot had seemed to read the enemy's mind. As Sarah flew back to Bagram for the last time, she knew what her decision would be. This was what she was meant to do, not seeking glory or recognition, but using her skills where they made the most difference. She would stay with the covert program, would continue to be the guardian angel that appeared when soldiers needed her most. Her last week at Bagram was bittersweet. Sarah said goodbye to Rodriguez and the logistics team, accepting their thanks and good wishes. They believed she was returning to a staff position at a stateside base, a deserved reward for her excellent work. She let them believe it, knowing the truth would remain classified. Major Harrison sought her out on her final day. He said he wanted to thank her personally for everything she had contributed to Bagram's success. Then, he added something unexpected. He said he had figured out her secret, or at least suspected it strongly. He didn't need confirmation, didn't want to put her in an awkward position. But if she was who he thought she was, then she was the finest pilot he had ever worked with, and he hoped she would continue doing what she did best. Sarah looked at Harrison for a long moment, then simply said thank you. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Harrison nodded, understanding passing between them, and shook her hand firmly before walking away. The flight home was long, and gave Sarah time to reflect. She thought about the soldiers she had saved, the missions she had flown, the double life she had led. She thought about her father's pride, Rodriguez's friendship, and Harrison's quiet understanding. Most of all, she thought about the A-10, the aircraft that had become an extension of herself, and the missions that still lay ahead. Landing at Andrews Air Force Base felt surreal. Sarah was home, but she wasn't done. After a brief leave to visit family, she would report to a new assignment, a new cover identity, and a new theater of operations. The covert program was expanding, and they needed experienced pilots who understood both the tactical and political complexities of operating in shadows. Sarah's father met her at Andrews. They embraced briefly, a rare moment of open affection. He told her he was proud of her, not just for what she had accomplished, but for the choices she had made. She had put mission effectiveness above personal recognition, had served with distinction while remaining invisible. That took a special kind of courage and commitment. Over dinner that evening, they talked about her future. Sarah explained her decision to continue with the covert program. Her father listened carefully, asking questions about her reasoning and her long-term plans. He didn't try to change her mind, didn't argue for the conventional career path that would bring promotions and public recognition. He simply supported her choice, as he had supported her throughout her career. The following week, Sarah reported to her new assignment. The cover identity was similar, a logistics officer at a different base, managing supply operations while secretly flying combat missions. The theater was different. The aircraft was the same A-10 she had come to love, and the mission remained constant, protecting soldiers and completing objectives from the shadows. On her first night in the new assignment, Sarah sat in the cockpit of an A-10, running through pre-flight checks. The aircraft was different from the one she had flown in Afghanistan, but the feel was familiar. This was home. This was where she belonged. Below, soldiers were conducting operations, trusting that air support would be there if they needed it. They would never know her name or see her face. But when they called for help, Sarah Mitchell would answer. The quiet logistics officer would transform into the deadly A-10 pilot, and the mission would be accomplished. Some warriors fought in daylight with cameras watching and medals waiting. Others fought in darkness with only the satisfaction of knowing they made a difference. Sarah Mitchell had chosen her path, and she had no regrets. As she lifted off into the night sky, leaving the lights of the base behind, she felt complete. This was her calling, her purpose. She was a warrior hiding in plain sight, and she would continue to serve in the way that mattered most, protecting those who needed protection, saving those who needed saving, all while remaining invisible to the world. The legend of the mystery A-10 pilot continued to grow, spreading from Afghanistan to other theaters. Soldiers told stories about the guardian angel who appeared when all seemed lost, who delivered devastating firepower with impossible precision, who never failed to answer the call. They speculated endlessly about who the pilot might be, creating elaborate theories and myths. Sarah heard these stories and smiled quietly to herself. Let them wonder, let them guess. The truth was simpler and more profound than any myth. She was just a pilot doing her job, a soldier serving her country, a warrior who had learned that sometimes the greatest impact comes from the shadows rather than the spotlight. Years later, when the classified operations were finally declassified, when the full story could be told, people would be amazed to learn that the legendary A-10 pilot had been a woman hiding behind a logistics officer cover identity. They would marvel at the missions she flew, the lives she saved, the impact she made. Books would be written, documentaries produced, and Sarah Mitchell would finally receive the recognition she had long deserved. But that was in the future. For now, on this night, and countless nights to come, Sarah Mitchell flew through darkness with steady hands and clear purpose. She was where she belonged, doing what she was meant to do. They thought she was just logistics, and that was exactly the point. In the gap between perception and reality, in the space where assumptions blinded people to truth, Sarah Mitchell found freedom to be her best self, a warrior, a pilot, a guardian angel watching over those who never knew she was there. The A-10's engines roared as Sarah climbed into the night sky, leaving another base behind, heading toward another mission. Somewhere below, soldiers would soon call for help, and she would answer. That was enough. That was everything. The rest was just noise, just distraction from the only thing that truly mattered. The mission, the soldiers, the sacred trust between those who fought on the ground, and those who protected them from above. Major Sarah Mitchell, logistics officer and covert A-10 pilot, flew on into the darkness. Behind her was a trail of successful missions, saved lives, and defeated enemies. Ahead lay more of the same, more nights, more missions, more opportunities to make a difference. She had found her calling in the shadows, and she would serve there as long as she was needed, as long as soldiers called for help, as long as there were missions that required someone willing to remain invisible while changing everything. This was her story, though most would never know it. This was her service, though most would never recognize it. This was her life, lived in the gap between what people saw and what was real. And Sarah Mitchell wouldn't have it any other way. Sarah threw herself into coordinating supplies for the ongoing operation, tracking the consumption of ammunition and fuel, arranging for medical equipment to support the increased casualties. On the surface, she was the dedicated logistics officer working overtime to support combat operations. Nobody suspected that she had been the one flying overhead, providing the air support that made the operation possible. Operation Mountain Thunder concluded successfully after 5 days of sustained combat. The Taliban forces in the valley were destroyed or dispersed, and coalition forces established permanent positions in what had been enemy territory. Commanders called it a significant victory, one that would change the strategic balance in the region. Sarah received a classified commendation for her role in the operation. It arrived via her secure phone, a simple message: Mountain Thunder success largely attributable to your efforts. Exceptional performance under extreme conditions. Highest commendation. There would be no medal, no public recognition, no ceremony. Just the knowledge that she had made a difference. A week after the operation, Sarah was working in her office when Major Harrison stopped by. He wanted to thank her personally for the logistics support during Mountain Thunder. The supplies had arrived exactly when needed, the coordination had been flawless, and it had contributed significantly to the operation's success. Sarah thanked him for the kind words and said she was just doing her job. Harrison lingered at the door, looking like he wanted to say something else. Finally, he mentioned that he had heard interesting rumors about the A-10 support during the operation. The pilot had performed extraordinarily, showing skills and knowledge that suggested extensive combat experience. He wondered if Sarah had heard anything about who had flown those missions. Sarah kept her expression neutral and said she hadn't heard anything specific, just the usual rumors and speculation. Harrison nodded slowly, his eyes searching her face. Then, he smiled slightly and said that whoever the pilot was, they were doing remarkable work. He hoped they knew how much it mattered, how many lives they were saving. After Harrison left, Sarah sat quietly in her office. She didn't know it mattered. She felt it every time she climbed into the A-10's cockpit, every time she heard desperate calls for air support, every time she brought soldiers home alive. Recognition would be nice, but knowing the work mattered was enough. Sarah pulled out a requisition form and started processing the next supply order. Logistics work never stopped, and she had a base to support. Later that night, she would fly again. There was always another mission, another group of soldiers who needed help, another chance to make a difference from the shadows. Been easier to seek validation by confirming Chen's suspicions. The next day, Sarah received her first mission assignment in over a week. A convoy needed escort through a dangerous mountain pass, and intelligence suggested enemy forces were preparing an ambush. It was a straightforward mission compared to FOB Lightning, but Sarah approached it with her usual meticulous preparation. That night, she flew again. The A-10 roared through the Afghan darkness, Sarah's hands steady on the controls, her mind focused entirely on the mission. Below, soldiers in the convoy heard the distinctive sound of the Warthog's engines and felt reassured, though they would never know who was protecting them. Sarah was back in her element, doing what she did best. The encounter with General Chun had been a reminder of the precarious nature of her double life, but it had also reinforced why the deception was necessary. Some missions required shadows and secrets. Some warriors did their best work when nobody knew their names. As she guided the convoy safely through the mountain pass and headed back to Bagram, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Let them speculate about the mystery pilot. Let them wonder and theorize. She would continue to be both the invisible logistics officer and the deadly A-10 pilot, two sides of the same warrior serving in the ways that mattered most. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft as soon as she shut down the engines. The A-10 was damaged, with dozens of bullet holes and evidence of at least one near miss from an explosive. But it had brought her home, just as it always did. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit on shaky legs, accepting a bottle of water from a crew chief who looked at her with undisguised admiration. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Sarah provided detailed accounts of every target engaged, every weapon expended, and all damage sustained. Intelligence officers took copious notes, asking questions about enemy positions and capabilities. When they finally released her, the sun was setting, painting the Afghan sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah made her way back to her quarters, utterly exhausted. She showered, washing away the sweat, and stress of combat, and changed into civilian clothes. Tomorrow she would be back in the logistics office, back to counting supplies and coordinating shipments. Tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had saved FOB Lightning. She had kept soldiers alive. The mission was successful. Her secure phone buzzed one final time as she was falling asleep. A message from High Command, brief but meaningful. Lightning sends thanks. Well done. Sarah smiled in the darkness, and let sleep claim her. Enemy fighters had fled into the mountains, abandoning their weapons and wounded. The special operations team was secure and preparing to move to an extraction point. Sarah made one final pass, confirming the area was clear, then climbed back toward safe altitude. As she turned toward Bagram, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of emotions that followed combat. Relief that the friendly forces were safe. Satisfaction at a mission accomplished. A hint of sadness at the lives taken, even enemy lives. She never allowed herself to forget that each target had been a person, whatever their cause or allegiance. The flight back was quieter. Sarah ran through her post-mission checklist, noting ammunition expended and fuel consumed. She would file a report later, though it would go to a very limited audience and never appear in official records. For now, she focused on bringing the A-10 home safely. Landing at Bagram under cover of darkness, Sarah taxied to the restricted area where ground crew waited. These men and women were part of the secret, cleared for the program, and sworn to silence. They would refuel and rearm the aircraft, repair any damage, and have it ready for the next mission. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. The debrief was quick. She reported the mission successful, all friendly forces secure, enemy neutralized. The intelligence officer taking notes thanked her and dismissed her. Sarah walked back across the base in darkness, changing back into her regular uniform in her quarters. By the time the sun rose, she would be back in the logistics office, counting supplies and coordinating shipments. Nobody would ever know that Captain Sarah Mitchell had just saved 6 lives and turned the tide of a battle in a remote mountain valley. Nobody would suspect that the quiet logistics officer had flown one of the most dangerous close air support missions of the war. And that was exactly how it needed to be, at least for now. Sarah settled into her bunk, knowing sleep would be difficult but necessary. Tomorrow would bring another day of inventory reports and supply requisitions, the perfect cover for a warrior hiding in plain sight.